Hello. Hello. Well, good evening. Um, Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful day. Uh, I'm so delighted really to welcome you all the Carnegie Library Lecture Hall for our mid-local event with our own Michael Sawyer, author of Sir Lewis, the definitive biography of really the greatest Formula One driver ever. My name is Soni Toneme. I serve as Executive Director of your Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures on behalf of our staff, our wonderful volunteers, and board. Welcome. Midlocal is presented in partnership with the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. It is where we celebrate our local writers and stories. And today, we welcome you in this beautiful hall. We want to thank the Regional Asset District, RAD, the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, and the National Endowments for the Arts for their continued support. Tonight's event is presented in collaboration with the David C. Frederick Honors College of the University of Pittsburgh. Our friends from Whitewell Bookstore are here with signed copies of Sir Lewis. After the program, Michael is happy to personalize your books. The book signing will happen right here, and the line will start in front of the banner here. So if you already have your book, you simply need to come here afterward. We'll have the line, and the line will wind around the hallway. If you have not bought your copy, I'm sure you're going to buy it after the lecture. We will start a line right here, and we'll go down this way. You get your copy. Once you get your book, we ask that you join the end of the line so we can keep it going. That's right. Tonight's event is going to be a lecture followed by a Q&A, a moderated Q&A with me. During the Q&A, we will ask for you to raise your hand if you have a question, and we will pass the microphone for you to ask the question. We ask that you keep your questions short and concise so everyone will have a chance to participate. Consider joining us this Thursday for our Words and Pictures event with Tracy Sawyer with her book, Mascot. The event is free and open to all. We ask that you bring the whole family. You can also visit our website to see more of the upcoming events that you're seeing, probably some right now. We ask that you silence your phone during the event and refrain from using flash photography. This concludes our announcements for this evening. Now, it is my honor to introduce Michael Sawyer. Michael Sawyer is an author and professor of African American literature and culture and the director of graduate studies in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh. His work endeavors to render inoperable the disciplinary boundaries between philosophy, theory, literary critic, and aesthetic. All of these are present in the book we are launching tonight, Sir Lewis. His lifelong interest in Formula One and global culture merge to offer a definitive account of the life and legacy of one of the greatest athletes of our era, Sir Lewis Carl Davidson Hamilton. I love that. It's so cool. Now, please help me give a warm Pittsburgh welcome to Michael Sawyer. Thank you. Thank you.
First off, this is really a great honor. I want to thank Sony, of course, for pulling this together, and thank you for all you all coming out for this. Writing books and the opportunity to explore them in communities are not solitary activities. I want to thank the Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures for pulling this together. This community benefits immeasurably from the visionary leadership of Sony. The work that happens behind the scenes that made this an enjoyable experience for us all, and for that is obviously I want to acknowledge the support of Christine Rivera and Lauren Stanislaw, staff members at the Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures. And I want to thank Patrick Fisher, the CEO of the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council, who has been so supportive of my work, and of course the Carnegie Library for hosting this event. This book is in many ways a dream come true for me, and the project was supported by the Department of English at Pitt by our chair, Gail Rogers, as well as the Honors College's Dean, Nicola Foote, and Brett Say, who were kind enough to provide a research assistant, the intrepid Abby Feather. Without Abby's hard work, this would have been a much poorer effort. I want to thank my agent, Faith Childs, and the people at Legacy Lit for their collective belief and work on this project, and of course, White Whale Bookstore for keeping local bookstores alive. I also want to thank those who endorsed this book: Maren Fader, Tamara Payne, Maisha Cherry, and my colleague R.A. Judy at the University of Pittsburgh. Finally, I want to thank my family who are here, all of it, my children, uncles, aunts, cousins, my brother, in-laws, or especially my parents, Ernest and Teresa Sawyer, and most of all, Mindy Whitaker, who supported this project even when I didn't believe it was possible at some point. Let's see. I want to call this talk Last Judgment: The Hamilton Renaissance for reasons I hope will become apparent. Lewis Carl Hamilton was born on the 7th of January in 1985 in Stevenage, Hertfordshire, England, to his parents Anthony Hamilton and Carmen Leibelester. He has a younger brother named Nicholas. Lewis is a professional race car driver. He has won 7 world championships, tying him with Michael Schumacher for the most in the history of the sport. From 2007 through 2012, he drove for McLaren. From 2013 to 2024, Lewis competed for Mercedes, and this season he has joined Scuderia Ferrari. Hamilton's main home is in Monaco. He is not married and has no children, and that is in some ways the whole story. However, not dissimilar to the fact that we are all here because of the Big Bang, these facts are not especially satisfying or probative. This book, Sir Lewis, is an attempt to fill in the spaces that these kind of vague biographical facts don't really help us with. In aid of framing the conversation I hope we have together, I want to borrow a quote from our host, Sony Tonami, who tells us in his writing, and Sony's a really accomplished poet. I don't know if he tells people that, but he is, right? Sony writes, "I build little rooms in my happiness and furnish them with the same appliances that I use for my rooms in sadness. This way I trick my mind to think that they are the same room. To be alive is for me to be conscious of these moments and navigate through them." Following Sony here, I want to situate sports broadly defined as a type of appliances that furnish these rooms that vacillate from happiness to sadness and spaces in between. Sometimes with the importance of sports in our society, we can be complicit in confusing the map for the territory, a concept that I'm borrowing from the thinker Sylvia Wynter. What that means is that when Augustus Caesar, also known as Octavian, made the assertion regarding the role of sports in the construction of society, he said, "I brought marble to what was a city of brick," talking about Rome. Trajan, who came after him, was more explicit, cynically asserting that the people are won by 2 things, bread and circuses. So this evening I propose in this edifice of marble that testifies to the wealth and love of the arts of Andrew Carnegie, we engage the appliances of Formula One and Sir Lewis Hamilton in service of both our happiness and sadness. Because as we know, Formula One is a fantasy world. It journeys from continent to continent, dragging millions of tons of material and thousands of staff people from venue to venue, lending glitz to already impossibly glamorous locations. What this book chronicles is the disruptive influence of the child from Stevenage, who could see himself as a Formula One driver before Formula One could see him, a visible man. Hamilton's first public appearance was on the Blue Peter children's television show, and I'll read periodically during tonight, I'll read briefly from the book a description of that event. This is in chapter 2 of the book, page 20. Anthony Hamilton had arranged for Lewis, the RC car phenom, to race his toy among hay bales that the staff of the show set up as a race course. The video is worth watching without the sound for a lot of reasons, not the least of which being because Lewis's answers to the interviewer's question consist of, quote, about a year to the question of how long he'd been racing, no to the answer of whether it's easy to do, yes to whether the host can have a go, and that's it. Somewhere around 14 words. The rest of the story is told by the imagery. Even in his first television appearance, Lewis is about fashion and makes a statement with his clothing. The jacket Lewis has on at 7 is the same color scheme that we would see in his livery in Formula One, royal purple. Most prominent is the intensity of his focus. He has no intention of losing to the host or anyone else in this moment, and pretty much any other. When you think about what Anthony, Lewis's dad, had set up for his son and what Lewis understands about the interview, is that there is a complex relationship between three things: time, opportunity, and skill. Lewis understands that no matter how much skill you have, it is meaningless without the opportunity and time to take advantage of it. The 65-second Blue Peter segment doesn't allow the time for long answers to silly questions, but what it does allow for is the opportunity to display his skill, which is driving. Lewis wins the stage race easily, and the host, trying to be funny, which is his job, makes reference to Nigel Mansell, the 1992 F1 champion, warning Mansell, the driver, that the radio control model racers are hot on your heels. Truer words had never been spoken. This, in my reading, is what Sony would understand as a room of happiness, ornamented and furnished by the brilliance of the 7-year-old who would lead even the great Nigel Mansell to say of Hamilton recently, quote, "I don't care what anybody says about Lewis. I've always been a fan of his. I was a lone voice for a while. He has made me feel very proud that I saw an incredibly talented young man who came and took the Formula One scene by storm." The numbers, and these are just the most obvious, speak to the greatness of this athlete. Lewis is unquestionably on the Mount Rushmore of not just the greatest athletes of all time, but also the culturally most influential. One cannot make that assertion without pausing to pay homage to the legacy of Muhammad Ali, who said, quote, "I'm the greatest. I said that before I knew I was," close quote. That statement overflows with a type of metaphysics that we'll leave to the side for now. But just to give you a point of reference, I grew up in the shadow of Ali. To me, he can never be defeated, a notion that was buttressed by this 1987 DC comic, Superman versus Ali. In that comic book, Ali knocks out Superman. And 2 years later, on October 2nd, 1980, when my hero, the demigod who defeated the superhuman from Krypton, was soundly beaten by Larry Holmes, I was inconsolable. My parents can verify this fact. I had become convinced at 13 that heroes always won in ways that were obvious. Part of the ambition of this book, as a dedication to my parents' proposals, is to remind us all that there is more to being called a hero than the cruel calculation of wins and losses. These, in my mind, athletes or even performances that have defined greatness exceed that place and become heroes because of that. First, I'm thinking of Jesse Owens, whose 4 gold medals at the 1936 Olympic Games dismantled the notion of Aryan supremacy, an ideology that would cause almost unfathomable pain to the planet. Next, I'm thinking about Jackie Robinson, who, like Lewis, broke a barrier that should never have existed. Formula One never suffered from the rules-based segregation of Major League Baseball that contributed to the troubled life of Homestead's own Josh Gibson. It didn't have to. The sheer expense that attends the sport, the torturous path to Formula One, et cetera, served as deterrent to generally all but the most well-heeled aspirants. The Hamilton family simply didn't have the money. I'll read a little bit again from chapter 2. Here we go. According to Frank Worrell, who wrote a biography of Lewis in 2021, the first sponsor to join what we can call the early version of the Hamilton Project was a cart chassis sponsor. The chassis provides the structure of the cart with the engines, wheels, brakes, and safety equipment accounting for the majority of the additional expense. This sponsor provided access to the zip go-kart that some people have pointed to in Lewis's career to say that he never was without money, which is not true. Again, the risk that Hamilton took makes sense in the aftermath, because what Anthony Hamilton did at the beginning was take tremendous financial and personal risk in order to fund his son's work. Karting is noted as expensive and time-consuming sport. The car is expensive on its own, but it's usually the case with this kind of hobby. It is also the stuff goes along with the hobby that damages bank balances: tires, fuel, racing gear, helmets, transportation, entry fees, lodging, food, repairs if you crash the car. Fortunately, the British enjoy universal health care, so medical bills won't bankrupt a family when a kid almost inevitably gets hurt racing. For a working class person, even the time away from doing the work of a working class person makes this all very difficult, and it quickly goes from hobby to sacrifice. Anthony scraped together the money to get his son his first kart and made a deal that so long as Lewis did his job in school, he would support his racing. To deal with this, Anthony took on multiple jobs to keep Lewis driving until someone somewhere would take the ride with him. A 2021 Business World article by Sam Cooper has a provocative and frankly silly title, quote, "When he was a kid, Lewis Hamilton's dad asked people if they wanted to support the first black F1 driver to try and attract sponsors." That's the title of the article. The effort, like the title of the article, didn't work. Cooper writes, quote, "Speaking to the Wall Street Journal, Hamilton said it went nowhere. The failure of this effort is worth keeping in mind for multiple reasons. First, Anthony was mindful of the possibility here and understood Lewis's race as being a component of it. Second, as we watched Lewis's efforts to diversify motorsport from top to bottom, the failure of his dad to find people willing to invest in the ambition of underrepresented people is exactly the point, especially when it comes to parents raised children that became the best in the world at their chosen vocations and did so from a place of what might charitably be described as abstract and almost dynamic ignorance of what these sports required. But what they each were all too deeply familiar with, each of them all too fluent in, was the experience of catastrophic disappointment that arrives in the form of structural bigotry. Pittsburgh's own August Wilson exposes what Sony would understand as a room of sadness that the playwright's protagonist believes can be resolved with offense. In Act 1 of Fences, Wilson stages an encounter between Troy and his friend Bono, which is interesting because Lewis's engineer in Mercedes was named Bono. The conversation is about whether Troy's son should be allowed to continue to pursue his passion for football. Troy had been blocked from realizing his own potential in baseball because of segregation. Bono reminds him that times had changed. Troy's best years were too early. Jackie Robinson had broken the color line that fenced out Troy, too late for him to realize his dream. Wilson gives Troy a voice to express the true nature of his pain. Troy laments, "There ought not never have been no time called too early." Anthony Hamilton agreed with that sentiment and created the time that we can safely call the Hamilton era, an era that undermines the narrative that is all too prevalent now about the standards of diversity being something about lowering expectations rather than raising them. Lewis refutes that in his career. The struggle that attended financing this adventure have been well covered, and I won't rehearse them anymore here at this moment, but another aspect I found interesting in the discourse is the discourse of care between father and son here. Ernest Hemingway gives us purchase in thinking through this. He is said to have proposed that there are only three sports: bullfighting, motor racing, and mountaineering. All the rest are merely games. Hemingway elaborates in the text of Death in the Afternoon, writing, quote, "We in games are not fascinated by death, its nearness and its avoidance. We are fascinated by victory, and we replace the avoidance of death by the avoidance of defeat," close quote. I review this complexity in the book, and here I want to read a bit from chapter 3, exploring the death of Ayrton Senna and how young Lewis processed it. This is a quote from Lewis. "The year before, I'd experienced the real dangers of motorsport for the first time. I remember it was early May and I was at Rye House. I had just finished a race. My dad quietly came over to me and said, 'Lewis, Ayrton Senna just died. He'd had a terrible crash at Imola.' I remember how I did not want to show emotions in front of my dad because I thought he would have a go at me, and so I walked around back when no one was looking. I just cried. I really struggled the rest of the day. I could not stop imagining what had gone on. I was only 9 years old. The man who inspired me was dead. He was a superhero, and that was him, just gone," close quote. Take note of the brevity with which Lewis deals with this tragedy in his quote. This is the entire statement of the death of his hero, except for a mention later that he never got to meet him, and paparazzi foiled attempts to pay homage at Senna's grave in Brazil. Senna's legacy continues to be part of Lewis's journey in Formula One and its particular importance for his activism. The clipped way that he deals with the loss is directly related to the way drivers deal with death. Obviously, this account of his reaction to Senna's death is told from the perspective of a driver, an adult driver, whose Formula One dream had come true, recalling what he had felt when he was 9 years old. but it reveals something interesting about the complexity of the relationship between Anthony and his child. What Anthony Hamilton knows is that the world, with or without racing, can be a cruel place, and more so for Black people. That is thing one. The hard exterior and tough love that Lewis recalls here is a common way of relating to children for Black parents who can be harsh to their children to prepare them for the world. Part of that is to learn not to let the world see that you are hurt, even in the face of unspeakable tragedy. You don't have to be a psychologist or somatic healer to know that this isn't the best way to develop emotional health, but it is an all too common an experience. Black people are often brought up to understand that the world doesn't care about their feelings. The world may or may not care about the feelings of Black people, but another way to see this episode is a proof that Anthony cared deeply about his son's emotional and physical safety. Lewis's account can be understood to be the story of a father who loved his son and he needed him to be clear-headed and take care while taking the same sort of risk that killed his hero. Anthony might well be saying in his own way that maybe on this racing weekend the fates could be cruel, and rather than placing laurels on the heads of once and future champions, they were swinging scythes at their necks. Lewis had his private cry that his dad pretended not to see, and I'll bet Mr. Hamilton had one of his own, and by his own admission, Lewis backed off for the rest of that weekend. And here we are at the threshold of what will, in all likelihood, be the last chapter of the racing part of Lewis Hamilton's story. 2,000 years on from Emperor Trajan's understanding of the power of spectacle, we return to Italy. And I want to summon here another artist to help us understand Lewis. And to be clear, I view Lewis as an artist, the man who defined the Italian Renaissance, Michelangelo Ludovico Buonarroti Simoni. After completing the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in 1512 during the papacy of Julius II, Michelangelo was summoned 22 years later by Pope Paul III to paint and adorn the altar in the chapter. 20 years is a long time now, but in the 16th century Italy, with a life expectancy hovered around 30 to 35 years, it was virtually a lifetime. During that 20-year period, Michelangelo's focus was not painting. The tomb of Pope Julius II, a library, and other architectural projects in Florence, his poetry and writing all absorbed his attention. A summons to return to Rome that late in his career and his both creative and human life to take up another physically demanding project for a pope in the Sistine Chapel was not something he likely had anticipated. In hindsight, the altarpiece is considered one of Michelangelo's greatest achievements. That was not initially the case. A companion of the Pope who saw the work in progress called it disgraceful. The artist heard him, committed the critic's face to memory, and found a special place on the fresco for him in hell to memorialize it. Likewise, as we were at the beginning of Hamilton's first campaign with the Scuderia, there have been glimpses of what is in store. And the commentary has been both global and unending, much of it positive, but predictably much of it also negative. Just as Michelangelo had reimagined the presentation of biblical stories in The Last Judgment, moving on from classical representations of Christian imagery to going so far as presenting a clean-shaven, naked, and muscular Christ, along with condemning his enemies to eternal perdition, Lewis has evolved. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and The Last Judgment serve as bookends to Michelangelo's career. Lewis's time at Mercedes, where he won 6 of his 7 world championships, and the Ferrari years will serve the same purpose, defining an epoch. In this melodrama, the ghost of Enzo Ferrari, Il Commendatore, the commander, the genius who created the brand, looms. The cars that are the children of the Wizard of Maranello's imagination are the objects of dreams in the world of Formula One. Lewis's first day at work would have brought a smile to Signore Ferrari's face. The biography, Enzo Ferrari, The Man in the Machine, characterizes the mindset like this, quote, "For most of his life, Enzo Ferrari's public appearances were flawlessly choreographed events designed to enhance the great man's image," close quote. The team had already announced that Sir Lewis would take up residence in Il Commendatore's iconic home, and for the welcome event, Lewis presented himself as a quintessential Italian elegantone, not in racing livery, but in a suit and tie. Signore Sir Lewis the Don. The subtle messages were everywhere. The 40-year-old Hamilton was posed next to the iconic Ferrari F40, the last supercar design overseen by Enzo Ferrari to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the brand, which was 40 years ago. The Tifosi, the Ferrari fans, both in and outside of Italy, went wild, and the season was more than a month off at that time, and Lewis had still never driven a lap in a Ferrari race car. The Scuderia and Lewis nailed the aesthetic. So Lewis is and always will be a fashion icon, along with his indisputable seat at the top of motorsports. No matter what happens over the course of this campaign, none of that will change. But we have short memories, What have you done for me lately? That's an unfortunate feature of sports culture. Before the stopwatch starts, before the microsecond margins begin, before the distance between victory and defeat is measured in millimeters, we should resist the urge to measure this final chapter solely in wins and podiums. Like Michelangelo's Last Judgment, controversial at first, later held as transcendent, Hamilton's Ferrari arc deserves to be viewed through a wider lens. In daring to don the red of Maranello, in choosing creation over comfortable retirement, Lewis has already achieved something remarkable. Hamilton has already given us more than we deserve. He has chosen to risk his legend in pursuit of one final masterpiece. Whether that masterpiece comes in the form of an 8th world championship or maybe 9th, or simply in moments of brilliant artistry behind the wheel, Hamilton, like the master of the Sistine Chapel, has earned the right to define his own success. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear us?
Test.
Perfect. The only person I know who is as well dressed as Lewis Hamilton sitting right next to me. You know it. I want to ask, how many of you went to Formula One? Drive to Survive? Okay, good. Perfect. That kind of gives me an idea which question to ask. But I wanted to start by asking you how you came to this project. Are you like me, or like most of us here, were you introduced to Formula One through Drive to Survive?
No, nowhere near it. So I grew up in the late 1900s, right? So in 1990, I graduated from Naval Academy, so I was in the Navy, and I was stationed in Naples, Italy. And I saw there was a race, Monza, so I drove up and watched the race. And back then it was like, you just drove, I don't think they had tickets. I don't think there were people literally hanging over the race course in trees, right? It was like, I'm like, if somebody falls, they'd be killed. So, that's when I was introduced to Formula One, literally in like the most, intense place you could possibly see it. And Ayrton Senna won that race at Monza in 1990. And so I was hooked from that point forward. I had grown up as a kid liking car racing because we had those racetracks, right? And that whole thing. So I kind of knew who some of these drivers were, like Jackie Stewart was around, and also obviously, the Indy 500 drivers we kind of knew about. But that was my introduction to Formula One. So it's been a lifelong kind of concern to pay attention to the sport.
Thank you. We will be asking questions from you, right, Chad? You will be asking questions. I will call on you to ask questions, but I, of course, have a lot of questions. So I wanted to ask you, if you do not mind, to tell us a little bit more about what makes Lewis Hamilton the legend that he is today, as a middle-class boy, right, growing up, and we have to say it, a black man, right, sure, and Formula One, and being the legend that he is. Right? What about him that made him the successful driver that he is now?
Yeah, I think, so Lewis is clearly what we would call a prodigy, right? I think that's clear, right? Even, and if you go and watch the Blue Peter episode that I've referenced, you can see all of it there, right? He's incredibly poised. It's a lot like watching those old kind of Tiger Woods clips when he was, with his dad on the Mike Douglas show and all these places, right? Like making putts, et cetera, right? So he's focused in that kind of a way, right? But the next level of analysis to me has to do with what you have to put up with or what you have to go through, right? So if you think about, in the sport I kind of know best outside of this is probably track and field, right? So it's obvious in some ways that Usain Bolt's the greatest 100-meter sprinter of all time. Like, he's run the fastest, et cetera. But I got to put my money on Jesse Owens, like in a race with him, because Jesse Owens is out there, on a dirt track. Jesse Owens, as far as I can tell, Jesse Owens smoked like 4 packs of cigarettes a day. He never lifted weights. The shoes were like these with like nails stuck in them. And, the biggest thing that Usain Bolt has to worry about is whether his limo is on time to take him to the track, right? He's, like Jesse Owens is dealing with like Hitler, like literally, right? So I got to believe that if all things being equal, Jesse Owens is going to pull it together, right? So I think the difference between Lewis and other drivers is he had all these other things. You'll see, I kind of cover this in the book, right? These kind of ugly incidents when he's a kid where grown-ups are trying to scare him away from the karting track, right? Like intimidating him, intimidating his dad. And Lewis is not a big person, right? Formula One drivers are typically fairly small for lots of reasons, right? But so he was taking karate in order to defend himself against adults who were trying to bar them from the track, literally, because he was embarrassing these people. And so, given all that, right, and so there's some practical considerations too, because often you'll hear the commentators when, one of the big things is tire wear in Formula One, right? And they'll say, Lewis is, he's got to go 40 more laps on these tires, it's not possible. And then he does it, they're like, how did he do that? And my point is he did it because he didn't have extra tires, right? From the time he was a kid, he didn't have excess, right? So Lewis started off having to be a person who basically marshaled his resources carefully, right? And so even in Formula One, when he has all the resources in the world, when other drivers need to slow down or go get different tires, Lewis figures out how to keep them together because that's what he had to do his entire life very early. So that culture, I think, is important to understand how that contributes to him being a great driver, even when the resources are there.
Now that you're mentioning the tire, I think the first question that I should have asked is for you to explain Formula One to me as if I was a 5-year-old. Right? For those of us who, right, for the people who are not here, could you explain what the Formula One is?
Yeah, so Formula One is first a designation of a type of engine mapping, et cetera, right? So you have Formula Ones, Formula 2, and Formula 3. So these are open-wheeled, single-seat race cars, right? You can picture that in your mind. But they're different than Indy cars because they have to do things that are more akin to daily driving than they are going around an oval, right? And I'm not at all denigrating Indy cars. You have to be fearless to drive in basically an Indy car pace line going 200 miles an hour with somebody like right behind you, right? These catastrophes that happen with these people. But you'll see a Formula One car will go from, and I'm thinking particularly about Monaco, right, where it doesn't have the top end speed of Monza, which can exceed like 223 miles an hour, which it's hard to explain to you, to imagine how fast that is, right? But a Formula One driver will go from going 140 to basically 30 miles an hour within 100 meters, basically, to kind of slam on the brakes to make a turn. Then you have to do that for 2 hours, right? Like over and over and over again. So it's tremendously demanding in different kinds of ways. And also, it's a global, right? So not only do you have to, because if you're an IndyCar driver, right, we know or Daytona, these other sports, it's kind of domiciled here in the United States, right? You don't have to pack up. So this weekend, the first race is in Australia, right? Then they pack everything up, they go to Europe. Then they pack everything up, they go to the Middle East. And they pack everything up and go to Asia. And they pack everything up. So drivers and athletes have to deal with all of that, right? Which is difficult enough, deal with food and, sleep deprivation and these kinds of things. And also, it's unique in the sport in that they compete against each other every single weekend, right? So if you can imagine, think of the most hated rivalry you can think of, I don't know, Steelers versus whomever, basically, right?
The Browns.
The Browns, Steelers, Browns. Imagine they play every weekend, right? Like every single weekend they tee it up again, right? It's like, and they, the players, some of them become friends, some of them begin to hate each other, but none of them are going to be in between, right? And so these 20 drivers basically follow themselves around the world from March through November in this kind of lengthy campaign that's gotten longer, right? There are more races this year than ever. And they have to do all this, and back to Hemingway, at the same time keep themselves alive, right? So the drive to survive thing is not just about surviving, staying in racing, it's also about not killing yourself. Because an unguarded moment in a Formula One car can end your life or cause catastrophe for other drivers that you're not paying attention to. That's kind of Formula One in kind of a nutshell.
Yeah. Thank you. Any questions in the audience?
What was your, I know you talked on the phone with them.
Use the microphone.
You met with them. Hi. I remember you were saying when you and I met that you talked to him on the phone and that you were meeting with him. What was your favorite memory over the last few years?
I think Lewis is, just really examining him really closely. I think he's the most gracious person in the world, right? And the thing and Sony and I were talking about this beforehand, right? It's it's easy to be media trained, right? Like, it's just media, people work at this, right? They go and, they're trained by the media to respond in certain ways to certain questions. But the question is, what do you do when it's like really hard, right? So I go to the 2021 season where they had stolen the championship from him. And he sits in the car for a minute and he gets out and he walks over and he shakes Max Verstappen's hand, right? And he shows up at the podium ceremony and is gracious and thanks everyone. And first, he always thanks the team first, right? He thanks everybody back at the factory and thanks all the fans. Then he gets to start talking about himself belatedly. No other drivers do that, right? Like you can watch, right? I've carefully examined this. And so what you'll see is that it doesn't work out where he's pretending that, right? That's literally who he is, right? So I had like one person interviewing me ask me whether the book was like a hagiography, right? And I didn't, I'm not a person who's trying to write a book to write bad things about somebody, right? And if you find a good person, it's cool to say is a good person, right? We don't have to in our kind of culture always seek to find some reason to tear somebody down. So I think part of the story here is that Lewis seems to be and has demonstrated himself to be a genuinely good person, right? Outside of everything else. And if that, that's the only thing you can say about an athlete at that level, I think that's important because, all this, some people tell you all the time, don't meet your heroes, right? Because, something ugly will happen or the person won't care or, whatever the case, but he does not seem to be that person at all. So I think that's what I would take about after spending all this time thinking carefully about him.
Mm-hmm. I want to follow up with that in a way we talk about how Lewis is so poised, and since that first time you saw the video and you could see this is a child and he was speaking so well, I want to ask about Lewis being more than a Formula One driver, right? The way I was introduced to Lewis, I was in 2017, was because he was in a show, I think a late night show. Yeah. He was invited to talk, and that was the first time I saw a Formula One driver, right? And Lewis seemed to be bigger than Formula One, which is a lot to say because Formula One is big, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about Lewis outside of Formula One? And in the book, you connected him with a lot of the great in America, Tiger Woods, like Serena Williams, right? Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit more about Lewis outside of Formula One as a person, as a legend, as a fashion person, all of the things that he's done?
No, I think this is really the enduring legacy. And I think it's important first to say, because typically when we say someone's bigger than something, it's like a negative, right? It's like, you think you're bigger than, because you'll hear sports commentators say, no one's bigger than the NBA, right? Yeah, well, sure, right? And I don't think Lewis is bigger than Formula One in a really kind of positive way, meaning that Formula One was a very kind of closed sport, right? And as a practical matter, you don't see a whole lot of books written about Formula One drivers because they're basically boring people, right? They drive fast, they date models, and that's it, right? So it's like a Vanity Fair article, right? Formula One driver was seen in Monaco with this model. Next week he was seen in France with that one, right? It's like, and that you can sustain that for maybe 15 pages, right? Mm-hmm. If that's what you care about. And I don't really care about that. But the point is, so what he's done in kind of pushing Formula One to kind of take stock of people that they would not normally view as aspirants to Formula One or fans of Formula One, I think makes him bigger than the sport. And then what he's done in fashion is important, right? And that's not necessarily unique, but wealthy people like nice things, right? So that's not super unique. What then begins to become important is like when he decides that he cares about, a person who's killed by the police in Kentucky, right? Or he cares about diversity, equity, and inclusion at grammar schools in Sao Paulo, Brazil, right? Or he's concerned about the LGBTQ community being represented as mechanics in, throughout motorsport. And he cares about women and the Formula One Academy that's trying to figure out how to make sure that a person who's identifies as a woman makes it into Formula One, right? And they say he's the only driver who shows up at these events, right? Mm-hmm. So we say he's bigger than sport is because the real question is, where does he find the time, right? Because as an athlete at that level, and I don't know. There may be someone in who's been the best of the world at something. I don't know what it is. I'm not the best of the world at being me 99% of the time, right? It's like, so when you think about somebody who's the best in the world at something, and also potentially the greatest to have done it ever, you just wonder when he can find the time to care about these things equally. Because lots of athletes will, as their careers wind down, will then pick up these things as points of interest, right? This has been a common thread throughout his career, right? So it speaks to a person who's, we use this term polymath a lot, right? He's has multiple points of concern and seems to be able to focus on all of them at the same time, which then makes him bigger than that individual sport, right? And he's in sports ownership, right? He's a part owner of the Denver Broncos, right? It's like, what athletes are out here owning teams outside of Great Britain, right? He doesn't own, there's some talk about him trying to buy a MotoGP team and et cetera, right? So he's always been concerned with all these things at the same time. So I think that contributes to him being this kind of person who's positively bigger than the sport. So I would add that, because you can be negatively or suspect that you're bigger than the sport, which means that you don't care about the sport itself, that you think that, fashion is going to be your thing. What Lewis does is he realizes that Formula One is a platform that he launches all these kinds of things from. So I think that's why that works out.
Yeah. Any questions from the audience? There's a couple hands here. Oh, I love your shirt.
It's actually a Charles Leclerc jersey. I don't have Lewis for merch yet because it's not.
We love Charles too.
Yes, we do. So I kind of have like a twofold question. The first one, kind of piggybacking off of what you just said. So a lot of what we all know about Lewis is he's taken that torch, I think, and Sebastian Vettel as well. I think
Sure.
it's a great example of this, is for standing up for things in F1 that are outside of it. You always see them at everything for Senna and for F1 Academy. With perhaps him ending his F1 career with Ferrari after that, what do you think that means for the future of F1? Because right now we have like a president of the FIA who is inviting people to events that they shouldn't be, and then turning
Sure.
around and telling Lewis, like, you can't wear a pride flag, things like that. And then my second question is silly, but do you think he's going to get his 8th with Ferrari before he's done?
Yeah. So I'll take the last one first. Yeah, I think he will.
Oh, wow.
I think a couple of things, right? I think it's just like the poetry of it, right? And sometimes it just works out, right? Like sometimes it's like, because the impossibility, this is the Charles Leclerc question that you're raising, right? I felt terrible for Carlos Sainz getting kicked out of his job, right, at Ferrari, right? But there are very few, I can't think of any, and I'd be glad for someone who's also a sports fan to help me understand this. There are very few teams that dominate an entire sport the way Ferrari dominates Formula One. And I mean, like, I'm a Chicago Bulls fan, period, right? It's like, I'm like a Bulls supremacist. I don't need to know, right? It doesn't matter to me who's on the team. I suspect at the beginning of every season they're gonna win a championship, and it's manifestly false, right? It's like they're not nowhere near. I tune in every day to check and score, I'm disappointed, the whole thing. But the Knicks are not ever gonna be, I don't care, right? So it's not a situation, and I have a friend, one of my closest friends, Charles, he's a bandwagoneer. Like he moves to San Francisco and all of a sudden he's this like Golden State Warriors fan, right? It's like, he's from St. Louis. It's like, we care about the Golden State Warriors. You could at least be a Sacramento Kings because they used to be in, Kansas City, the whole thing, right? So I've never been but I think that's a long way around to saying I think everyone's a Ferrari fan, right? I think at the end of the day, if you ask enough, and Sebastian Vettel said this, he's like, we all are Ferrari fans because everyone comes into F1. It's like, I bet people don't go to law school. Everyone, I bet at some point when they decide to go to law school, suspects they're going to go argue in front of the Supreme Court. Like, you're driving behind some bus with some guy on there who's like hustling drunk driving cases that person wanted to be a Supreme Court justice at some point, right? And I think Ferrari's like that. Ferrari for drivers is like the Supreme Court for lawyers, right? And he got there. And I think the team and his relation, and this is in the weeds in some ways, but his relationship with Frederic Vasseur, that goes back to his Formula 2 days and before that, I think there's trust there. I don't think, and I love Charles Leclerc, we were talking about this before, I don't think Charles knows how to string together a season to win a world championship yet, right? So as a practical matter, there are only 3 drivers on the grid now who know how to do that. You got Max Verstappen, who I don't think has a car to do it this year. And we know what Max does when he doesn't have a car, he runs into people. And it's just demolition derby. And then Then you have Fernando Alonso, who's been washed. Fernando Alonso hasn't won a race in since probably 2007, maybe 2006, right? He's just been around. So I don't think there's anybody who knows, and I'm including Lando at, and we were talking about this before, like Lando even said a couple of weeks ago, he's like, if I want to drive, it'd be really cool to see Lewis win at Ferrari, right? So even his competitors are like pulling for him, right? And I don't think it's going to diminish the competitiveness of it. So I think he can probably win. And I think that's important. So to the first part of your question about what this means. So I think the Ferrari thing, Lewis had to leave Mercedes-Benz, right? And I think about this for long-term reasons rather than short-term reasons. This gets back to what you're saying about what needs to be repaired about Formula One, right? Because the current F1 director has brought people back who were banned from the sport, who are cheaters, et cetera, right? Racists that banned from, not supposed to be anywhere near Formula One, hanging around again. He doesn't care, right? So that has to be fixed. But I would bet you that there are lots of Mercedes-Benz owners who do not know or care that Mercedes-Benz has a Formula One team. There is not a single person who owns or aspires to own a Ferrari that does not know they have a Formula One team. If you go to Ferrari's website right now, the first thing that comes up is Scuderia Ferrari, the Ferrari. You got to keep scrolling to find the cars. If you want to buy one, you got to get through. So the long-term relationship with him and Ferrari as the marquee of the entire sport, I think will tend to be able to resolve these kinds of problems, right? So I think that's important, and I think that, and Lewis has no positive relationship whatsoever with the current director of F1, right? Who's the FIA, who really needs to be dismissed, I think, for lots of reasons. So I'm optimistic about it, both from a perspective of structurally what should happen with the sport, and also his opportunities for the next couple of seasons.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm just interested to get your critique of the Netflix show and kind of this influx of new fans, new American fans, particularly. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's great, honestly. And I get it, right? It's like, oh, you're not really an F1 fan. It's like, and everybody should, it's one of these things where, it's cool to be the only person who cares about something. Like you may be like a Civil War buff and know everything there's to know about, like some unit in the Civil War. You got the stuff in your house, you got books, you got, obscure books written, maps, the whole thing. But it's also cool if you can talk to other people about it, right? So I think what Netflix did, and it was one of these things that happened during the pandemic, it gave people something to hold on to, right? And I think it was interesting, and I think the footage is just incredible that they have. And I've learned things, like we were talking about this before. I did not know in watching this season that Carlos Sainz had basically blown off Williams. He had a meeting to sign and basically just didn't show up, right? And Netflix was there to film him signing the new contract, the whole thing. He just didn't show up, right? And was flirting with going to Alpine with Flavio Briatore. He's a person who was thrown out of the sport and is back now. So I think Netflix has been positive from that perspective. And I'm not when I say, like, cultural critic is what they call people in academia who do what I do. I'm not critical in the way negatively so, right? So I'm always trying to look for like what's positive, because we have enough bad stuff to talk about, right? So I'm not gonna get mad about lots of people liking Formula One. Now, my friend Charlie, who likes the Golden State Warriors out of nowhere as a bandwagoneer, I don't like that. Just because it gives me reason to clown him, but that's like a personal thing. So, but no, I think Netflix has done a good job with it. I learned stuff from it, like literally, and when I say learn things, like internal to the access that they have is unbelievable, frankly. And from an aesthetic perspective, those seasons when Lewis wasn't around really create this kind of interesting void to kind of write and think into. So I like it.
I want to ask a question for the book. You mentioned 3 drivers, right, in the history of Formula One that you think belong in the GOAT discussion. Yeah. I'm not going to mention them. You have to read the book to find out. And you mentioned as well 3 criteria, if I do not, I think 3 criteria, right, that you think that will make someone be the GOAT. Do you mind talking a little bit about the 3 criteria? But first, tell us, who do you think will be the 4th driver? and using the three criteria, why this driver should be the fourth one.
Yeah, so the fourth driver is Ayrton Senna, right? Who I would say, if not for this kind of untimely, his untimely death, simply would be in that argument. And so this gets to the criterion, right? The first is obviously championships won, right? You can't be the greatest driver of all time and not have demonstrated that you can pull together over and over again during the season what it takes to win. There's lots of drivers, not lots. There's probably 6 to 7 drivers in any given season who can win an individual Grand Prix, right? But only 1 or 2 of them can string together wins, can string together podium finishes, can string together DNFs, did not finish, and still be able to recover the next week, right? So that's part of that question, that just how you manage that whole thing. The second criterion is longevity, right? You got to be around to prove you can do it over and over again, because the thing with Formula One is the technology changes oftentimes, from season to season in minor ways, but there could be major alterations. So part of that is how do you adjust to like major changes in the sport? And Senna just didn't have an opportunity to do that, right? In kind of the V10 era, he didn't have an opportunity to show that he could go to the hybrid area and create the same kind of thing, right? This is not to denigrate Ayrton Senna at all. The third, and why Senna would be in this argument, is just cultural effect, right? Like, and this is what I was saying about what Lewis has had to overcome and what do we understand about him outside of. Ayrton Senna has the same type of broad cultural appeal, right? It's like, if you're a Brazilian, in Brazil, I learned this when I moved to Italy. This is before I even went to the Formula One race, right? I went to this trattoria the first night I got there. There was this picture of Christ that was about the size of this book. There was a picture of the Pope that was like slightly bigger. There was a picture of Maradona that was the size of this like wall, basically. This kind of Argentinian soccer player, right, who had captured Forza Napoli, right, who was like, to them, was bigger than God and the Pope, right? And Ayrton Senna in Brazil is bigger than God and the Pope, period. There's no doubt about that, right? And it transcends lots of things. So to me, he would be the fourth person in that conversation. And those are the three, it's one of the things where you write a book and someone says, what'd you say about this? You're like, uh-oh, right? Can I remember? Those are the 3 criteria. I can remember what they are.
Thank you. And to say Ayrton Senna is Lewis Hamilton's role model and favorite driver too. Question here.
It's interesting discussion about greatest of all time. I don't know the answer to this, and I'm hoping that you perhaps either asked or you've heard Lewis ask the question. When Michael Schumacher was asked, who's the greatest of all time and where do you fit? He made a statement, and I won't go into it, but we're bringing up Senna, we're bringing up Fangio, we're bringing up Nuvolari. Do I still speak of Nuvolari? I was wondering if Lewis has been asked that question, and if you know what his response was.
Yeah, he gets asked it all the time, and I think he's coy about it in certain ways, and I think he's self-deprecating. He certainly feels he's the greatest. He certainly has said that he knows that he established kind of an era, and he certainly knows that he's tied with Schumacher, who he views as, in this conversation, as one of the greatest of all time, period. So I think he's been reticent to kind of say that because, I think internal to the sport, he knows that there's a lot of other things that have to be considered, and I think if he were to win an 8th, I think he would have probably a more clear answer from him about that. And if he does it at Ferrari, I think he would have a clearer answer. But he's been like circumspect about whether he even cares about that as a kind of a designation. So.
I would love to talk about the future, but I just keep going back to the past.
Sure.
I'm from New Orleans, so I've seen an egregious play call or lack thereof in 2018 when we had a pass interference that precluded us from winning the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
So I like to know, like particularly in Formula One, where the director can talk to the team boss and Massey and Toto Wolff in 2021, and when Massey was like, "That's racing," and it just was reeking with privilege. me being very nascent to the sport compared to you, I got blue. I got a little depressed seeing Lewis in the car and embracing his dad. What I really like to know is how did you process it? And then the other part I'd like to know is how long do you think it'll be before we see another black driver on Formula One?
Yeah. There's a kid now, his name escapes me, who's coming up through, who's in Formula 3 now. I think he's in Formula 3. Yeah, he's in the Mercedes Young Driver program who's good, right? But it's, it's a narrow road, right? And there's a lot of pressure. It's a lot like, waiting for the next Tiger Woods in some ways, right? It's like, you're gonna wait. Or, what's the movie like looking for, the Bobby Fischer thing, right? Like Bobby Fischer was there and then he was gone, right? He left this kind of thing. I think Lewis is in that category. The Michael Masi, the call, yeah, we've all seen bad calls before. We were talking about this beforehand. Like my cousin is an NBA referee, right? I won't say his name, but he's made some really bad calls. He's made, I shouldn't say that. He's gonna
Google it.
He's gonna be mad. He's made important calls. Like he's had the finals like the last probably 7 years. I tell people, if you see him, it's over this game, right? He's going home, right? This is the end. But he never changed the rules, right? And it was as if, to give some frame of reference, it'd be as if a team was down by 6 points, right? And there's 20 seconds left in the game, right? There's really no way, to call it 10 points. They're down by 10 points, 20 seconds left in the game. No way for them to win, right? There's one possession left in the game, basically, if you use the shot clock, right? They score, so now they're down by 8. Then the referee gives them the ball again and doesn't let the other team play defense. They score again. Now they're down by 6. Then the referee gives them the ball again. That's what happened in that race. The referee.
Do you mind explaining?
Yeah. So
Abu Dhabi.
This was a catastrophe. So the the context here is Lewis had fought back to being tied for the very last race with Max Verstappen to win his 8th championship there in Abu Dhabi, right? And the fight to get there was like, scraping and clawing like every single point he could possibly find. And so they're tied going into the race, but if they tie, if neither of them score any points, Max wins because he'd won more races, so they go to the tiebreaker. Like who's won more races during the year? So he'd won more, so he would have won. So if they both crashed in each other, Max wins. So Lewis gets to the point with five laps left. He's up by 17 seconds, right? Which 17 seconds at 170 miles an hour is a long way, right? And between Lewis and all those and that Max Verstappen are a bunch of lapped drivers, right? Because Abu Dhabi, you have 5 lap drivers, right? Abu Dhabi's a long course, so people get lapped. So then Nicholas Latifi, who, Manya, she loves Nicholas Latifi, right? It's like this guy's gonna cause problems, like, he shouldn't be out there. He crashes, right, and causes a safety car to come out. So this is in Formula One where there's a crash, they bring the safety car, everybody has to slow down. And I'm like, get the champagne, Lewis wins, right? And I'm like, there's no way that they can ever restart this race because they gotta clean the track off, they gotta get a crane to come and pick this thing, and at the same time, the drivers are driving and counting off laps, right? And you can't change the order at that point, right? There's 2 laps left now. And what's supposed to happen is they declare the safety car is over with. Now they have another full lap for the other cars to unlap themselves. Then one more lap under the safety car, the race is over, right? Michael Masi, the race director, tells them they're gonna have a race. He gets on the radio, says this. He's like, everyone between Lewis and Max Verstappen, get out of the way, right? And Lewis had not come in and changed his tires because this is back to what I was saying about marshalling tires. He's driven the perfect race. He's up 17 seconds, can't lose. Max Verstappen can't put a dent in this lead. He puts him right behind him with Max on brand new tires. Then it's worse because if you go back and watch it, Max Verstappen routinely violates the safety car rules by exceeding Lewis a couple of times, right? And Max Verstappen wins the race and wins the championship. And they literally changed the rules while the race was happening. It's the worst call, and I wasn't around. People like the cheating incidents, like the black socks and the kind of stuff like that, right? I've never seen anything like it, because when you're a sports fan, you expect bad calls. I feel sorry for you with the Super Bowl and the interference. Yeah, I get it. That's a judgment call, but they didn't say, it's a touchdown anyway, or, whatever, right? Come up with a new rule to basically refute. So, and that was it, right? I don't think anyone's ever seen, I'd be interested in hearing from other sports fans. I've never seen anything like it before. And literally, it was as if, like I said, they just kept giving the other team the ball back in order for them to win the game, period. That's what happened in the race. Not well, right? I vowed never to watch sports again at that point. I was like, I'm giving up sports, right? Because, you invest in it, right? It's like, I was ready for this, because it was a hard fight to get to that point, right? And Lewis his drive in Brazil that year was probably the greatest Formula One drive of all time, right? Like going from last to first in that race to get himself even, to then go, and the Brazilian fans, they went crazy at that race, right? Because he was, the Senna thing, they gave him honorary citizenship. Senna's family came out to see him, the whole thing, right? So this is the poetry thing. Then he gets to Abu Dhabi and it's tied. And then the first lap goes off and Max Verstappen tries to run him off the road and doesn't pull it off, and he gets distance. I'm like, whoosh, okay. And then you're holding your breath this entire time, right? It's like I tell people, it's like watching, getting back to Bulls, it's like watching Bulls games in the 90s, right? If you were up by 2 possessions, the game was over, period, right? It's not like now, you'd be down by 50, it's halftime, you're down by 70, then you go and get something to eat, you come back, and the team down by 70 is up by 30, right? It's like, what happened? They're just running back and forth, right? So you were like, he's gonna marshal, he's got this under control, right? And outside of some catastrophe, engine blowing, or some clown like Nicholas Latifi running into a wall out of nowhere to mess the race up, but then Michael Massey then completely changed the rules in order for it. And so that was my biggest problem. And I was of the mind for weeks after that Lewis should have quit, right? Walked away from the sport and been very vocal about why he did it. And I think his seasons after that were affected by that kind of soul-crushing catastrophe, right? To be in a position to win an 8th world title after all that work and then have it snatched away, and not from anything but some guy deciding to change the rules. And then Formula One comes back and says, yeah, you changed the rules, but we're not gonna change the result. Why wouldn't you? If you get caught in the Olympics and 10 years later they find out you cheated, guess what? You're gonna turn that medal in, period. They're gonna come to your house and collect it, right? And they're gonna fix the record. That's what should be done about that, honestly.
I'm looking at the time. I want to make sure that you have time to buy books and to get them signed afterward. And I want to thank you again for this wonderful book. I want to end by asking a question about your next project. What are you working on? And are you working on something with Toni Morrison?
Yeah, I'm working on, I'm one of these, I've always trying to work on the next thing, right, to my detriment, right, I really want to write, I think there's another, I think the Lewis's Formula One years at Ferrari's worth another book about that, right, kind of period. I think that's worth doing. And I hope this will give me additional access to really dig into that, because there's real questions about what goes on in Italy with this whole experiment and with Ferrari. I think that's fascinating from a cultural studies perspective. I want to write a book about Wynton Marsalis and music and what he's done to recreate jazz with the Lincoln Center, that kind of thing. I'm working on, that's kind of bubbling around. So those are things, and then I'm working from this hardcore theory, I'm working on a book about, Toni Morrison's a huge influence on my work. I'm working on a book about Morrison's work, kind of broadly, literary theory kind of thing. Real page turner, you want to tune in. There will be no event like this for that book. With children. I want to hear from my man, where'd your son go with the, he wants to step out. This little boy, he's got the, he's got the Lewis Hamilton Mercedes livery on. I saw him when he came in. It's really exciting.
It's really exciting. Well, I want to ask him one last question. What should we look forward to for this upcoming season that is starting on Sunday?
Yeah.
What are the things that you're excited about?
I mean, I'm excited about what happened in testing, with them coming out of testing. And I'm excited about Lewis's attitude, because he had, frankly, he was not in a good place with Mercedes these last couple of years, right? And so I think he seems ready for this challenge. He's excited about it. obviously the Tifosi, I don't know if you saw the footage from in Milan last week, right? It was like, it looked like St. Peter's Square, when they announce a new pope, literally, right? They were out there for this. And so I think that's gonna be exciting. Like if you can imagine Lewis Hamilton winning a Grand Prix in Imola or at Monza, it's gonna be crazy, right? In ways crazier than the Eagles, like with their post-victory celebration. So that's gonna be crazy. So I would look for that. I think, and this is the point of the book, right? I really want people to be able to pause, right? And just be, it's like, you know, from a literary perspective, to me, it's a lot like if you were alive and got to go to like the Globe Theater, like what's shown tonight? Something Macbeth, I don't know, this guy wrote it. Right, you get to go and watch this, right? And I think it's at that level, right? You get to watch this person do this. And I think you don't get that, as a sportsman, you don't get that opportunity often. So I think one of the things I'll be looking for is just to enjoy it and take from it what there is and hope it works out, but don't be me at 13 where it's like, it's a catastrophe if it doesn't work out the way you want it to.
Oh, thank you so much. Please help me say thank you to Michael. Wow. Thank you. Let's get some book signed. Buy your book here and we'll start the line right here. Thank you. We'll go back to the good room.
Yeah.
And then we get it.